And folks, I know I've been promising a book list for a while. I'm going to do a brief book list today as an introduction to Communism series that I think will give you a real strong foundation for understanding communism, subversion, and issues like this. I thought it'd be most interesting to start off with what's happening now in politics. And so I put together a quick list for y'all on kind of a primer to give you a foundation, I believe, of understanding what's happening in the US right now. So to start off, I would recommend these ones. The first one I'd recommend is The New Totalitarians. This is by Roland Huntford. What's interesting about this book is it details how the Swedish model of socialism works. Basically, they were doing social engineering tests in Sweden and created a model of kind of like cultural mediocrity where everybody aspires to the middle. Nobody wants to rise above the middle. And, you know, it works in an area where it's kind of like everybody keeps each other down. Everybody prevents everyone else from rising up. It's almost like a culture of, say, class jealousy, where if a person sticks their head out a little bit, they feel exposed and they try to bring themselves down. People don't want to aspire towards anything. They don't want to try to accomplish major things. They want to aspire towards the middle, keep their heads down, maintain the basic order, and that's just kind of how things work. And it's enforced through this kind of grassroots system where people attack people if they put their heads out. We see the same trends, the same models that were used in Sweden being replicated in the US. And the culture for this, the way they did it, this book actually lays out the whole system of how they did it, how it was tested, the methods of doing it, and how, once you read it, you can see the same exact things being done in other parts of the world, in the United States, in Canada, in most parts of Europe. And it gives you a good sense of where a lot of these, snowflake cultures are heading, this safe space mentality, where it's heading. Again, New Totalitarians, highly recommended on it. Next, I want to recommend New Lies for Old, and this is Anatoly Golitsyn. This is a classic, one of the classics on Soviet subversion. And if you want to learn about communist subversion in the US, New Lies for Old is one of the main ones. Golitsyn talks about a lot of these different types of front operations, especially when they're used to create pseudo events, when they're used to create smoke screens, when they're used to create, false flags, hashtag, and how these things work. A few of you asked me before about, Q and stuff like that. And I think I replied, I don't jump to conclusions on stuff. I tend to take things with a grain of salt until I can prove or disprove it. I tend to regard things generally, as a possibility unless I can prove it. But I did say that, one of my concerns is that it would be like a trust operation, that it would be something like this. And Golitsyn actually talks about how the Soviets did something like this, Operation Trust. A lot of you may not have heard of this. And it's interesting. I'll read you a bit of this. It says, the Soviet security services was recognized, was reorganized. They renamed it the OGPU. I won't get into too much. But they say a characteristic but not unique example of this technique provided by the so-called Operation Trust said innocent persons could be used by the regime in various ways. They could act as channels for disinformation. They could be blackmailed and recruited as agents, so on and so on. Basically, it says that in 1921, as the NEP was being launched, the OGPU created inside Soviet Russia a false anti-Soviet organization, the Monarchist Alliance of Central Russia. It had once been a genuine organization founded by Tsarist generals in Moscow and Leningrad, but liquidated. Basically, what you had was white Russian generals. Again, this was shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution. White Russian generals who were, according to what everyone was being told, they were told there was this league of anti-communist generals who were fighting a secret war against the communists, right? They were fighting a secret war against the communists, and everyone should get behind it because this was the battle. This was the battle of, this was the battle against the Soviets, and it was being taken care of because there was a secret war taking place between these white Russian generals and the Bolsheviks. Turns out that the Bolsheviks, the Soviets, were actually running the organization. And again, that was called Operation Trust. And so people were putting their hope in this organization that legitimately was releasing anti-communist information and saying, hey, we're fighting these guys. But it turned out they were working for them the whole time. You actually saw a play on this in George Orwell's 1984. But basically, they get behind this secret organization that's fighting back against Big Brother. Turns out it's a front operation the whole time. The whole thing's controlled opposition, Operation Trust. One thing you deal with real disinformation is they can actually release real information. They can actually release true information, even very incriminating true information. But people can actually use that. If you're, for example, creating a movement like Operation Trust, you could release all the real dirt on the Soviets through it. But once the Operation Trust movement is let's say dismantled or proven to be a front, all that true information is then regarded as conspiracy, even though it's true. And so this is one of the things to be concerned about with this stuff. Again, Golitsyn's New Lies for Old, must read, I think. Next up, we have a classic, Propaganda by Edward Bernays. And this book explains this was actually, let me get the year on this. It was actually written a long time ago. 1928. It was written in 1928. Bernays laid down the model of propaganda, which is what it is, that's used in modern advertising. And in laying out the model for propaganda for modern advertising, also laid out the model that's being used for modern political campaigns and for a lot of modern media organizations. Definite must-read book. It's a very, very important book. It really lays out a lot of what's happening in the world right now. And if you understand these types of tactics, you can look at how they're doing it. This is a quote from it. I'll read you. It says, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society." This is a foundational text of modern advertising and modern politics. You hear that? The manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. Must read when it comes to understanding the tactics being used to manipulate your opinions, your worldviews, and so on. Next up would be The Law. And this is by Frederick Bastiat. It's fantastic. The Law by Frederick Bastiat really gives a great overview of the nature of government, how people create government basically as a way to protect their interests, right? We come together as societies and form a government to protect ourselves, whether it's an organized militia, a tribal monarchy, or whatever, a system of cooperation to defend our property, to defend our lives, to defend our well-being, right? But to protect, as our founding fathers said, right? To protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that governments are instituted among men in order to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The problem he mentions with government, though, is that it has the tendency to eventually gain powers to itself, which it then uses to suppress the very thing it was created to defend. Government turns, again, from something created to defend our interests to something that tramples our interests. He talks about plunder and legalized plunder, and also the difference between a well-functioning government and a tyranny. And he also criticizes a lot of the a lot of the different philosophers at the time of the American Revolution or the French Revolution, specifically on the French Revolution side, and really explains the nature of what they were saying in very logical terms. And it's interesting because if you read The Law, a lot of what he says echoes very well today, because a lot of the philosophies he's criticizing have become kind of the foundation of modern societies in a lot of ways. Next up, I would recommend deeply The Road to Serfdom by F.A. Hayek, another classic. And The Road to Serfdom, it's a bit like Golitsyn, I'd say, a bit like The Law in terms of explaining the nature of government and the nature of socialism. What's interesting as well is it explains Nazism and fascism in the same light as socialism, because again, National Socialism, and again, Mussolini being one of the most influential socialists in Europe in his time, F.A. Hayek really lays out the nature of socialism very well. Highly recommended book, right? The Road to Serfdom. How ironically the people who talk about liberating us from servitude and stuff end up creating societies based on the principles of slavery. People enslave themselves through the rebellion to overthrow slavery. Ironically, right? Fantastic book. Next, a personal favorite of mine, Ludwig von Mises's Socialism. It's a bit like reading a dictionary, so try to bear with it. But this is probably the most comprehensive and in-depth book on the nature of socialism, what it is, how it functions, criticisms against why it doesn't work, and really at a time when a lot of the ideas of socialism were pretty much being destroyed by guys like Mises. Fantastic book. Really gives very logical reasons on why the entire socialist system doesn't work. Now, Ludwig von Mises was one of the main guys with the Austrian School of Economics, and so it is more on the economic focus. But what's interesting about Mises is that he also understood that socialism / communism were not about economics. He explains them specifically as metaphysical systems. They are like religions, they're beliefs. And actually, in the time of Mises, and even going back to the time of Marx, they were understood as such. They were understood as metaphysical theories. They were not economic theories. They were metaphysical theories. In other words, religion, right? Beyond the physical, metaphysical, and about ontology, which is kind of like the purpose of life, right? An interpretation of man's destiny. This was really what socialism and communism is. Fantastic book. Again, a bit like reading a dictionary. It's a bit heavy, but if you can bear with it, it's a wonderful book. Next up, I'd say actually this is probably my highest recommended of all of these. This is an Epoch Times series. The Spectre of Communism is Ruling Our World. You can actually we have a video series on this, I believe, on the NTD website, on the NTD YouTube channel, and on the main Epoch Times channel, I believe, on YouTube. We have a whole video series on this. We also have an audio book on it. We also sell physical books on the Epoch Times website. And so you can buy the physical book. We also have the articles online. We have an audio book free online, and we also have a video series free on YouTube. But I highly recommend this. This is probably the deepest dive into the metaphysical nature of communism that I think you'll find. It explains communism from the perspective of a metaphysical theory, a religion, and explains exactly all of its stages in terms of what it has done, all of its stages of what it has done and how it did it. Fantastic book. I would actually recommend this number one. I mean, if you were to read this and nothing else, you would have a really, really good foundation for understanding socialism and communism and everything that it's doing right now. And last but not least, a book I highly recommend and I talk about often. I lost the cover for it, and so this isn't the normal cover. But Disinformation by Ion Mihai Pacepa and Ronald Reichlak, which explains a lot of how the Soviets, through different influence operations, front organizations, and so on, created a lot of the problems we have in America today. It talks specifically about how they subverted the World Council of the Churches. It talks about how the Soviets framed, manipulated, and falsified information to create the whole scandal of the burning of the black churches. Turns out the whole thing was false. Was proven false, but people had already formed the perception that it had actually happened. The individual, one of the main author on this, Ion Mihai was the, I believe, highest ranking Soviet defector. I want to say he was a 3-star general, but he was from Romania. So he worked under Ceausescu. And under Ceausescu was running a lot of these operations to basically sow discord, sow chaos, spread disinformation in the West. And folks, at a time when we're being fed the word disinformation all the time, right? I'm sure everyone hears this word. It was not a well-known term before 2016. Disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda are actually different, quite different. And a lot of the people peddling the whole narrative on fighting disinformation are themselves actually promoting disinformation a lot of times. This book gives a fantastic foundation for understanding disinformation, what it is, how it's being used, and how a lot of front organizations in the US, going back to the time of the Soviets, framed a lot of the perceptions we have even of basic history. Even how a lot of the things that we take as being basic history, commonly accepted, things that we, look at history and think totally happened, a lot of them were totally falsified. Fantastic, fantastic book. Highly recommended. All right, folks, that said, again, we're doing these live broadcasts every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. And also, folks, please check out epochtv.com, EPOCH TV.com.